Welcome back, everyone. So I'm just going to get right into this. Now, last week I made a video where I discussed how Nurse is not holding back the game or otherwise bottlenecking killers of the game in any real sense. And of course, just discussing the subject does beg the very obvious question of who or what then is holding the game back. Obviously, this game has a lot of issues. Killers are too weak, perks are out of control, and the survivors are just overpowered when you get right down to the fundamental mechanics. And what is actually holding this game back is survive with friends. Now, I know this is going to be a very contentious topic, so just bear with me. And for those of you who are scoffing at this, honestly, look no further than last week. Right before I was hospitalized, Twitter was abuzz with the new changes that were going to be happening to the flashlights. Specifically, that the devs were going to be removing an exploit from the game that allowed survivors to make flashlight saves when a killer was picking someone up out of a locker. And I know there's some people already shaking their heads and rolling their eyes, but yes, this is absolutely an exploit. And moreover, this is also something that you don't really see solo survivors performing. In fact, you'll almost never see a solo survivor performing this, because this particular type of flashlight save requires coordination and setup, which means that one survivor is intending to jump in the locker so that they get picked up by the killer, while another survivor is in position getting ready with the flashlight. This is only something you see in Swift. And going back to Twitter, well, what was going on Twitter? There were only two major opinions of the flashlight change on Twitter. The first and more reasonable opinion was, okay, so they're removing this exploit that Swifts were abusing, and they're making a buff to flashlights. Well, we'll see how it all pans out and see how this plays. And then there was the other opinion, which was, oh my god, the game is over. Oh my god, how are you taking away our toys from us behavior? What is going on? This is ruined. You're ruining the game. Again, this bears repeating, and that is that this is really only a maneuver you're realistically going to see in Swifts because of how much coordination and how much setup is required to get these done. I mean, it's almost impossible you're ever going to find a solo survivor pulling this off at all. Now, if we're being honest here, this isn't exactly the first time we've seen Swift mains crying like this. We saw Swift mains cry when they removed one window from the shack. We saw Swift mains crying when they removed insta flashlight blinds. We saw Swift mains crying when they switched perks like Sprint Burst over to the exhaustion system, so you couldn't just abuse Sprint Burst every 30 seconds over and over and over again and loop a killer infinitely for free. We saw Swift mains crying when they adjusted how survivors are able to vault windows and the window vaulting speed. We saw Swift mains crying when they made it so that windows could be blocked off so a window couldn't be abused over and over and over again. We saw Swift mains crying when Decisive Strike got a very needed nerf. We saw Swift mains crying multiple times when Old Borrowed Time was nerfed. We saw Swift mains crying when Starstruck was added because it was a hard counter to Swift's body blocking the crap out of killers trying to lead a survivor to a hook. We saw Swift mains crying multiple times throughout the years whenever pallet numbers on maps were adjusted because there were far too many pallets to be fair. There still are, arguably, but they've just complained every step of the way. Keys took 4 years. 4 years to be balanced away from being an abusive toy for Survive with Friends groups. Now keys still do maintain a degree of power. They are very useful still, but they don't have the ability to be abused by Survive with Friends groups. And that's just it now, isn't it? I mean, now that keys are no longer abusable, I almost never see them in a match in Dead by Daylight. I think just about any one of us can affirm that if we actually pay attention, we almost never see keys being used in matches. And it's not because they were a fun or fair mechanic, it's because specifically Swift groups were abusing them. Especially toxic Swift groups, because they knew they could be toxic and they knew they had this key to back them up and help them and their toxic team escape from a match without any consequences. With all of that in mind, we now have to look at the way that killers are specifically designed. Now, it's pretty clear that killers are designed and balanced around going up against a team of 4 solo survivors. And while it would be easy to say that, well, then it's solo survivors who are really the bottleneck, that's not the case, because killers are then needed to be amped up to be able to address some of the issues caused by the coordination that you find in Swifts. This is why more and more we're seeing killers come in really only one of 2 flavors, and that's the flavor of high mobility teleporting around the map like Sadako, Dredge, Freddy, and Demogorgon, or it's the anti-loop / counter loop builds that we're only seeing, such as Artist, Wesker, Nemesis, Pyramid Head, Demogorgon once again, and then of course more recently with the Knight, who's nothing more than Artist with sprinkles. Now, while it would be easy to say that, well, then it must be the solo survivors who are bottlenecking the game, that couldn't be further from the truth. If the game was actually balanced around solo survivors, with Swifts being as strong or as relatively strong as solo survivors are, we'd start to see greater flexibility in the powers of killers. We'd start to see more variety in the way that killer powers are designed. Instead, we're seeing them very narrowly focused and becoming more and more the same. And that's the reality of where the bottleneck really lies and where the game is being held back. And it's only because of just how much more powerful Swift teams are than solo queues. And we end up with a situation where killers, by and large, are being funneled into one of 2 archetypes just to make them viable against Swift teams, but at the same time not overly oppressive to solo teams and new players. And at the same time, we're not able to see buffs to the base kit of most other killers, because then that would make those killers, even though they'd be viable against Swifts, it would make them very oppressive against solo queues and new players. So the real problem lies with that disparity of power between solo and Swift, meaning that we don't need to buff solo to Swift levels, because that's equally problematic. We need to actually bring down the power of Swifts, and part of that has to do with map design. In addition to map design, there's also the survivor perks. Behavior needs to go over all of them, the complete list, and just start nuking many of them. And there are some that just need to be axed altogether. By themselves, they might not be necessarily overpowered, but when used in concert with other perks and perk builds, and used with a coordinated team, these perks can become incredibly overpowered very, very quickly. And on that note, it's not Swift that's the problem by itself. I mean, Swift currently is a problem, but it's only a problem because behavior allows it to be a problem. There's plenty of room in the game for Survive with Friends, and I'm fully supportive of that, but I do believe that Survive with Friends does need some heavy changes to make it more fair. And in making it more fair, making it closer in line to what solo is now, I mean, at the same time, solo survivors could use, I guess, a little bit of a buff to bring them up, make the 2 of them meet halfway. We'd suddenly see that behavior would have the ability to be more creative with their killers. We'd be able to see a buffing of killer base kits, and at the same time a reduction of the reliance of killers on perks. So perks themselves could be nerfed. So killer perks wouldn't be so oppressive. They'd be more of a flavor than a game changer per se. And would really be able to see a lot of positive changes, really, if behavior would just balance Swift. But until that happens, Survive with Friends is going to be the bottleneck of this game. It's going to continue to hold the game back, and it's going to be the reason why you see killers just looking the same. They're just going to be the same killer over and over with a different skin and a slightly different ability. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. The real reason that that Dead by Daylight is being held back. The real thing that is bottlenecking the game, it's not the killers, it's survive with friends. And it's not all survive with friends. It's specifically these very vocal, very toxic survive with friends players who refuse to give up any power that they have in the game and refuse to even admit that Swift is as powerful as it is. I mean, it's a ridiculous thing. But anyways, that's gonna do it for me. I know this video is a bit on the longer side. There's a lot that kind of goes into the discussion, and I tried to keep it as concise as possible. Again, if you have any questions or you want to discuss it, down below I am open to all sorts of discussion, agree or disagree, and I'm hoping that we can have some good ones, because you know what, I've had a couple of good discussions in my videos lately, so I'm actually quite pleased with all of that. And you know what, not all of them ended up with people agreeing or whatnot, but we could at least see eye to eye, and that's that I feel is pretty important, because we're never going to see any positive changes in this game if we aren't willing to at least discuss them, or at least willing to see eye to eye. But anyways, that's going to do it for me, ladies and gentlemen. I think I've prattled on long enough, and I will see all of you guys in the next video. Bye.